and amazing prices. Java's mission is to be the community where great gaming gear is sold at reasonable prices by putting the market in the hands of gamers by building the best place for you to discuss, buy, and sell your PC gear. Java is also proud of their GPU and CPU buying program, where Java will make you a direct offer on your used CPUs and GPUs to help immediately offset the cost of your new hardware. Simply click on the Get an Offer button and see an instant offer on your components. Java's buyer and seller protection policies ensure safe and reliable transactions, while verified sellers offer and has to offer from enthusiasts just like you. Follow the sponsored link in the description below. So essentially it's like the same, I think it's even the same PCB. It kind of looks like it, to be honest. Yeah. Everything still appears to be in the exact same spot when I see the caps and the chokes and stuff. So honestly, without taking the cooler off, which I guess I could, it does appear like it is going to be the exact same PCB. Anyway, with that said, does it give us the exact same performance? Well, the numbers initially are different. What I mean by that is the B580 Intel card, the limited edition card, has 20 Xe cores, 5 render slices, 20 ray tracing units, 160 AI engines, but a 2670 megahertz graphics clock, 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and 192-bit memory bus, and a 190 watt TDP. This has essentially all the same specs, obviously, except as a 200 watt TDP and a 2740 megahertz clock. So it's a 70 megahertz faster core clock on here. That's going to be very interesting to see on the charts because of the fact that both of these cards out of the box with their automatic boost logics, which again, if power limit, headroom, voltage all have a little bit extra headroom available to them, the clocks will push themselves based on the power to frequency curve. And that curve does go beyond both of these cards' rated megahertz. They both went to 2850 megahertz, locked across the board, making them essentially the exact same card, if you will, in terms of frequency and such. So initially off the bat, this third-party card did not give us any sort of an actual like benefit in terms of performance anyway over the Intel card. It did cost $20 more. It's a $269.99 MSRP versus the $249 MSRP of the Intel Arc B580 limited card. So it is a longer card, as you can see, in terms of height and length. It's a little bit taller. You have a little bit more extending off the top. It is a 2-slot card. They call it technically 2 1/4 slot because technically it does encroach over the extra slot. Lengthwise though, some really small form factors might have a problem with the length of this card, but otherwise I think it would be fine. Again, the PCB stops like right here. The rest of this is just additional cooling, and that did actually show in the benchmarks. It ran on average 10C cooler than the Intel B580 limited edition card. The B580 card ran anywhere between 78C to 79C, fluctuating back and forth depending on the type of test that it was running. So if we were running a 1440p with ray tracing type of test, it was like 78C typically. The Sparkle card was actually running at 70C, pretty much locked across the board. So the larger cooler with the vapor chamber is clearly benefiting. And if these are the same PCBs, which they really do look like, then the larger cooler with the bigger fins and heatsink definitely was beneficial to nearly 10C worth of additional cooling. But all of that aside, why don't we go ahead and talk about the fact that it's performing exactly the same. It's very rare that we get an add-in. I've done many videos expressing like third-party cards are very rarely worth their price premium. Now we're talking $20 in this instance. It's not huge. There are some cards you can pay $200 in price premium and going with an add-in board partner. So if we look at Port Royal here, you can see the 580 Titan scored 2 points more than the 580 Limited. If we take a look at Time Spy Extreme, that one actually had a little bit of a difference there. 7148 versus 7097. Again, a non-tangible difference. Like these synthetic benchmarks, like anything 3D Mark, are intended to really make small differences look bigger on charts, because it really is just like a Hall of Fame type of a enthusiast overclocking utility to create a leaderboard. So little changes can lead to big differences, but in this instance, you would never notice that. Borderlands 3, the 580 Limited was getting 111 and 81, and the 580 Titan was getting 111 and 81. Like exactly the same number, not even a run variance. That's what's crazy about this. And Phil did a lot of the testing for this, and he basically told me, yes, I checked. Yes, we ran them multiple times. Yes, I made sure that I wasn't filling in the wrong cell on our Google Sheet. It's just that is how identical these cards are performing. If we move on over here to Cyberpunk 2077 with DLSS off and ray tracing off, the 580 Limited, 96 and 63, and the 580 Titan, 96 and 63. Again, the exact same numbers, which oftentimes with the add-in card, you don't get them landing exactly in the same number. Usually there's maybe 1 or 2 FPS difference. This is kind of crazy. Again, but in Cyberpunk 2077 with RT on, the exact same story. 39 FPS and 25 FPS for both cards for 1080p and 1440. Phil, are you sure you weren't like, I just don't want to do this, I'm just going to write the same numbers?
Dude, I spent so much time retesting it because I also couldn't believe it.
I'm starting to look like you want to go home early on Friday.
No, like I spent extra time on Friday because it kept getting the same numbers, and I'm like, no, this feels wrong.
It's literally, I think it's literally the same card. Like, I think it's quite literally the same card with a different cooler. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 580 limited, 153, the exact same numbers again. Shadow of the Tomb Raider with RT on. Oh, there's 1 FPS difference in 1080p on that one, a 109 versus a 108. Both are 76 and 1440p. Forza Horizon 5, the 580 limited, 108, 10. Oh, so the Titan beat it in 1440p by 1 FPS. Let's talk about power real quick, and then we'll do a teardown. I'm actually gonna open these up. I wanna know now if they're the same PCB. I just have to know. This chart looks weird. I talked about this in the initial ARC launch for the 580 on the Intel card, that the 4060's power fluctuation was just all kinds of all over the place. This is a measurement of both the PCIe slot as well as the PCIe power slot or power cable. And the 4060 is the only card that was pulling from both. The rest of these cards were pulling pretty much all of their power except for maybe 2 to 3 watts from the PCI Express cable itself and not the slot. And the only line that's different on here versus the limited edition card review is going to be the yellow one that's drawing a line straight through the middle of the 4060, making it, ironically, the most efficient card of the bunch. And that's what's weird about this because of the fact that these cards have 190 watt TDPs, but both of them are pulling far less than that. You'll see on average, the Sparkle card was pulling about 120. The Intel card was pulling about 135. The only reason I can really account for this, because with the PMD2, we can measure everything as well as software and hardware monitoring of this, is the temperature difference might be what's making up some of that power draw difference. As cards get hotter, they will pull more power. Efficient loss through heat leads to more power draw. So the only thing I could think is the near 10C difference we saw on the Sparkle card makes up for the power difference we're seeing versus the Intel card and the Sparkle card. That's the first thing that made these two cards different. Outside of their acoustic profile of the fan types and such, and the fact that, quite honestly, this is purely subjective, I think this card is ugly AF. First of all, I'm blue colorblind, so this to me just looks like a weird shade of almost like a violet-y color. The backplate doesn't even match the plastic, so the backplate almost looks purple to me. And then the fan blades, I can't tell if they're gray or green or blue. Like, I can't tell what color they are. So that's just a subjective thing. I think you'd have a hard time finding a build to put this in where it did not literally stick out like a blue thumb in this instance. But that Sparkle color theme, that's what they go with. This is one of those times though where the $20, it's like, save the 20 bucks, to be honest. If you're watching this video at a time when you can still get the Intel card. Let's not forget, the Intel card has the word limited on it. It is a limited availability card. When they're gone, they're gone. Intel is not in the business right now of selling cards via first party to retail. They are in the business right now of designing cards and then having their board partners basically do the bulk of all the sales. Kind of the way NVIDIA used to do it. In fact, NVIDIA didn't used to sell cards at all. Then the Founders Edition cards stuck around and they were limited, and then Founder Edition cards started living the entire life cycle of the family of GPUs. So right now, Intel's kind of in that middle category right there where they will offer their Founders card or their limited edition card for a short while, and then when they're gone, and you have no choice but to go with the board partner cards. I don't know what other MSRP options exist outside of Intel itself. The Sparkle card is the only one I have any details on at the moment. But if you're watching this video when both are available, I would truly just get the Intel card and save the $20. If not, the $20 markup is explained with the fact that they have to source their own coolers and everything and put them together, right? They're sourcing the die and the design from Intel, and then Sparkle's responsible for putting its RAM chips on there, its VRMs that they have to source the parts from. They're just getting the core architecture from Intel. So that's where a lot of the extra cost comes from. Let's tear it down, both cards, because I really want to know now if they are the same exact PCB. So I just went ahead and went right through that sticker there. It doesn't say void, but it does let them know if you've gone into it. So this is a Torx. What size Torx is this, in case you're curious? I can't read that. It's a small one. If you have an iFixit kit, it's guaranteed to have the right bit, okay? There's our new slogan. If it's an iFixit, it's guaranteed to have the bit. Shut up. It's a jingle. All right, look at that layout. You can tell it's very rectangular based on that tension deal right there. They can get away with actually just taking the backplate off and not having to deal with, see, these are Phillips. These are not the same. I think I can get away with not having to take the paste off. That way if I have to do any further testing, I have the same exact way that it's shipped. Okay, they are not the same PCB. Already, the power plugs are different. So the reason why I can say that they're not the same is because you see how the fan plugs and the LED are on the edge of the card, on the end? This is right here. So it could very well still be like a reference style card, but they might have moved the power plug or whatever based on for their cooler. That way it's not coming out right here because they need the space for that big plug, right? So I was just curious whether or not they were the same. So what brand RAM do we have here? Okay, so we got Samsung RAM. They are tied into the cooler right here. The cutest little VRM links that you've ever seen. But I gotta repaste that now. Paste is fairly dry. GPUs tend to use a thicker, more dry paste than say a kind of a liquidy paste because of pump out. So because they go through easily through the direct die contact, they can phase change quite a bit. If you go with a very liquidy type of paste, and with gravity, especially if it's vertical, it can pump out and then lead to higher temperatures over time. So I'm gonna leave the Intel card assembled without taking off the front side so I'm not messing up that paste. So this is always gonna be our reference card that we can compare against as cards come out. I had no problems taking the front off of the Sparkle card, but look at the size of this cooler for something so efficient. Yeah, I might as well clean that die off real quick so we can kind of take a look at it. So this really does give me hope that they might be able to scale this up. Give us like a 980 version. Actually, you know what? Give it a different number. They're just recycling old NVIDIA numbers now. Think about it. 580, 570, 750, 770, whatever. So it's just crazy to think that we're getting this level of performance now out of this teeny tiny little thing. But you know what? That's one of the reasons why it's performing so damn good versus a 4060, because it has 12 gigabytes of VRAM on there. All right, well, there you go. That's the Sparkle card. Not a whole lot to talk about. It's literally the same exact performance as the Intel limited edition card when you take into account its auto overclocking and stuff. And there's no way to really turn that off. I mean, it's just, we installed the driver and off it went. There's no we didn't do any overclocking. These were just out of the box. So if you can get the Intel card, save 20 bucks. If you can't, well, that's how that one did. It's the same thing. With so many people building and buying computers again because prices have really kind of sort of returned to the realm of normal, we're going to talk today about 5 things that you should absolutely positively know are a complete waste of money when it comes to building and upgrading your PC. But first, speaking of money, I've got to pay my bills, so roll it. For those looking for a high-end custom gaming experience, look no further than Falcon Northwest. Falcon Northwest has been building PCs made for gamers for over 30 years with a focus on a true high-end gaming experience. Custom cases available only through Falcon Northwest feature state-of-the-art testing and design to ensure that every component is performing at their best through thermal imaging and rigorous lab testing designed and overseen by the Falcon Northwest founder himself. With a complete lineup of systems ranging from small to large, every Falcon Northwest system includes a 3-year warranty policy and a year of 2-way overnight shipping coverage, providing the ultimate peace of mind. To see all that Falcon Northwest has to offer, follow the sponsored link in the description below. All right, so these are in no real particular order. They kind of are, but not really. Just they are all completely interchangeable. The first thing I have on here that I came up with is completely oversized power supplies. You know, there's There's an old adage that people used to go by. When I say people, I mean old folks like me, where like upgrading RAM might have gotten you a speed improvement, or upgrading your power supply was somehow apparently going to be better. It's easy to overspec your power supply. Now you want to leave some growth. You want to leave some room for future upgrades where, let's say you have a 60 series graphics card or like a 7600 XT AMD card or something like that. Yeah, you can get away with like a 500 watt power supply, right? But if you decide later on you want to find a really good deal on like a used 3090 or something like that, which you know is a 400 watt card, about 350 watt to 400 watt card when it comes to overclocking or even custom models, then your power supply is not going to cut it because you need a bigger one. But it's easy to go too big. So we've got an RM850X here and an RM1000X right here. And the price difference between these two can actually be pretty significant. They're both gold rated power supplies. It's also extremely easy to overspend on your power supply by going a way higher 80 plus rating than you would ever need. So if you're running like really high end hardware, like 4090s that are overclocked and custom water cooling and overclocked 14900Ks, which are huge gluttons for energy, or let's even say like the new Threadripper stuff that's out that gets ridiculous amounts of performance with this 96 cores, but also eats up like nearly 1,000 watts plus for just the CPU, then yeah, you're gonna be looking at a high rated power supply, probably a 1500 to 1600 watt power supply, which is the biggest we can get in the US, by the way. I think in Europe, they can actually get 2000 watt power supplies because of their volt system versus ours. You would never wanna put like a 1500 watt power supply on a basic PC. So do some research, find out how much power you really need for your system. There's calculators out there on like, I think PC Part Picker even has a power calculator, so you can put in your parts and it tells you what the recommended power supply size would be. And usually that builds in a little bit of extra growth. That way you have room for upgrades in the future without having to buy a whole new power supply. Fortunately, power supplies are something that can move along with you as your build matures, as long as you don't underspec it. But it's also very easy to accidentally spend $300+ on a power supply that you'll never even use 50% of its usage out of. So this next category is one that we all, I think, are guilty of sometimes going a little bit too crazy with, and that is our RAM and overspeccing our RAM. RAM has three major categories to it: the capacity, the speed, and the timings. And all three of those can have a huge impact on your system. Now, if we're talking gaming systems, typically you do not need huge amounts of RAM. Some games and some titles can use a bit of system RAM, depending on how big the world is and how much the CPU is having to do work when it comes to that title. But for the most part, people can get away with like 16 gigabytes of DDR4 running at 3800 megahertz and be perfectly fine for years to come. When DDR5 came out, it kind of started that race all over again. Well, how big can the modules get and how fast can they get? So now like you can get 8 gigabyte DIMMs with DDR5. They're actually rarer to find than 16 gigabyte DIMMs because that's kind of the new spec and the new JEDEC standard. But 32 gigabytes for DDR5 is so much more than anyone would ever need for a gaming PC. Now the question is, do you need 5200 megahertz DIMMs, 4800 megahertz DIMMs, 8000 megahertz DIMMs? And if you go and look at the pricing between every time you step up maybe 400 or 600, because it's usually increments of like 200 megahertz is where they tend to increase. The price difference between something like 5200 megahertz versus something like 7200 megahertz can often be double the price of the RAM. And more often what you'll find is the faster transfer rate of like 7200 megahertz sometimes has a slower CL or timing than something with slower RAM, but with a slower transfer rate. So sometimes for gaming PCs, you find it's better to have tighter timings than super fast RAM. But that's where a lot of people tend to get confused. So if you want me to do a video about gaming and timings and overall transfer rates versus timings, and then we're even talking binary and non-binary RAM these days, because now that we can get 48 gigs, 96 gigs, and all these other things, it includes a whole different level of complication when it comes to setting up your RAM. So if you want me to do a video about that, do me a favor, hit like on this video. But what I've got right here are actually two nearly identical sets of RAM. This is 5200 megahertz. It is also 32 gigabytes. This is 5200 megahertz and also 32 gigabytes. But the Nominator Platinum RGB is significantly more expensive than the Vengeance. That's because this was their flagship RAM at the time. They've come out with new RAM since. This is just what I grabbed. But this has RGB lighting and it uses IQ and it has all the temperature feedback and it's got the nicer heat sink on there. And overall, it's just a better looking RAM. But in terms of performance between these two, if I were to have a like Pepsi challenge here, and have a system with a cover on it that you couldn't tell which RAM set was on there, you would never be able to tell the difference, period. But you can easily double the price by grabbing a set like this versus this. You got to ask yourself, how much do these pretty little LEDs on top matter to you, at least in this particular instance, versus saving some money and having more to put into your overall build and maybe step up your graphics card or your CPU specs, or just have more money back in your pocket at the end of the day, knowing you got a good system that you didn't completely blow the budget on. So this next one, I don't really have any like demonstration to show you here, but everyone knows what I'm about to talk about is just a complete fallacy, and that is gaming edition anything. Even a potato PC can be a gaming PC if you play a game on it. There's no such thing as a quote-unquote gaming PC. There are PCs that are optimized for gaming, meaning that the graphics card that's in there, it's going to be fast enough to be able to turn your gaming settings up. But even a work PC can be a gaming PC. It just may not be great at it. But what happens is manufacturers have found about a decade ago, like, hey, if we put gaming on something, then the idiots will buy it. So that's where we started seeing like literally everything had the word gaming in the title. Now, more often than not, that gaming is nothing more than maybe a colorway or like a whole aesthetic look to it, or RGB. See, the first RGB stuff really was gaming. And that's when it had lights and stuff on it, but they weren't necessarily RGB. Like they might have had red lights or blue lights or they blinked or something, but you couldn't control them. They just had that sort of like a old Star Trek-y kind of look to it. Then RGB came out and that became the new quote unquote gaming. But even a so-called gaming monitor today is so ridiculous because gaming had, the term gaming had to stay out ahead of the industry's baseline spec models. So what is a gaming monitor today is not the same as what was a gaming monitor 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, a gaming monitor typically was anything over 60 FPS. That's it. Like TN panels, colors were absolutely terrible. It looked like you were looking at it through reflective foil. It was awful. But it had 120 hertz or 144 hertz refresh rate. It was 1080p and it had like a 1 millisecond response time. That's all people cared about. But then as IPS monitors came out, they were slower, they had better color accuracy, but they were slower. You weren't getting them over 60 FPS, the response time wasn't great. Then the technology moved forward. So how did the whole term gaming stay ahead of that? 240 hertz panels, 300 hertz panels, 340 hertz panels. Now we got like 400 hertz panels. So that's really where the term gaming kind of stays ahead of the curve so that it makes you think you're actually getting something necessary for it, but you're not. So if you're shopping for anything and you see the word gaming in it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Just know that it's a kind of a bit of a marketing psychology trick, if you will, thinking that you're getting, oh, I want to build a gaming PC, therefore there's the gaming model, I should get that one. When the base model right next to it will probably get you 95% of the performance and features of whatever's quote unquote the gaming model. And this goes for graphics cards too. In fact, that brings me to my very next topic here, which is specifically going to be custom PCB, high-end, high-tier graphics cards. So what I've got right over here are two RTX 3080s. This is a 3080 Founders Edition, which it's so cute by today's standards in terms of its size, but we know this thing is actually a pretty badass graphics card. It will run just about any game that you want to run, 1440p or 4K, high settings, has good ray tracing. The performance was there. The cooling was there. Nothing was crazy about this card. It was a well-performing, didn't want to melt itself card. And it retailed, when it supposedly retailed, for $700 brand new. This is the iGame GeForce RTX 3080 water-cooled graphics card. Doesn't necessarily say gaming on it, but it's their Neptune edition. It's their top-of-the-line water-cooled card, and it was something like $500 or $600 more expensive than an RTX 3080, putting it pretty close to what you could have gotten an RTX 3090 for. The thing was, the price gap between the 3080 and the 3090 was $700 and $1,500. So it gave so much room for these manufacturers to come out with these custom models that could just slide up well over $1,000, $1,200, $1,300. But buying something like this for $1,300, that is gonna get you marginal improvement over even something like a Founders Edition card because of the fact that the silicon was only able to really be pushed so far. In fact, out of the box settings on this compared to a Founders Edition card would have probably run in the neighborhood of maybe 100 megahertz faster. We are talking 5% difference. 5% difference is You cannot tell 5% improvement from one card over another by staring at a screen without an FPS counter going. And that's where you start to realize you're throwing money away, because of the fact that if you cannot tell by looking at it and just experiencing it that you're getting better performance, then that is by definition a waste of money. Now, what you will get with something like this that's water cooled and whatnot is you'll probably get longer life in terms of keeping the silicon nice and cool. The cooler the silicon runs, the better the boost tables are going to be. But NVIDIA controls how far these boost tables are allowed to go, so they can't even boost up any higher than any other custom card will be. It'll just hold those boost clocks longer if you live in a hotter environment, or you have a long gaming session and heat soak starts to become a problem. But remember, these AIOs only touch the GPU die, like the RAM and the VRMs and all that. As that gets hot, that also has an algorithm built into how the boost tables work when it comes to heat soak. So think about the fact that this card costing like $500 more than a 3080 did. It's like the cost of your CPU for the most part. It may not have been $500, it might have been $200 or $250, but still, any amount over, realistically, even just a Founders Edition card could be considered a waste of money. Because let's not forget, NVIDIA, I don't know if AMD does this, but NVIDIA, we know for a fact their Founders Edition cards are custom PCBs. They are custom built cards. They are not the reference spec. The reference cards look entirely different than this. But so they have good RAM modules in here. Typically they're running, I think, Samsung memory inside of the NVIDIA cards. And they're hand-picked GPUs because of the fact that they're building them for sale. So they have a pretty good bin and ASIC quality to them. So you can often find Founders Edition cards boost just as high as even the highest tiered custom AIB card out there. And they're always MSRP models. So look at how much money you can waste just on your graphics card. Now, the last place I think people tend to waste money is their storage. We're going to take NVMEs as an example here. PCIe Gen 5 gives us a huge uplift in performance in terms of data bandwidth and speed for storage. Now, graphics cards right now are not really taking any sort of advantage of Gen 5. In fact, I think all the cards out right now still are technically Gen 4, but I could be wrong on that. But anyway, you're not going to really notice any differences on Gen 5 or Gen 4 when it comes to graphics cards. On storage, like this T700 from Crucial runs over 12,400 megabytes per second. In fact, we even did a video about this and got every bit of that performance. And I even tried heating up the card, or ran the card over and over and over and over and over and over and over, just nonstop going on the disk benchmark, like Crystal Disk, and was not seeing any sort of reduction in performance because of the fact that the motherboard we had it on had a heatsink, so it performed well. So PCIe Gen 4 is 5,000 megabytes per second. Now, of course, that is like large file. It's moving one file from one location to another. It's not having to seek and search and find files. That's where you're going to get that speed. As soon as you start, you're never going to see that sort of transfer rate as it's moving a lot of small files, because it takes time. And then we have PCIe Gen 3, which if you look at Gen 3 now, that seems really, really old. However, this is still 3,500 megabytes per second. You guys can go and look it up on your own time. The difference in price between this drive and this drive is significant. Now, this is only a 500 gigabyte drive. Of course, this is a, 1 terabyte drive right here, I think? No, this is a 2 terabyte drive. You can find 2 terabyte Gen 3s and whatnot. In fact, it would be a heck of a lot cheaper than a Gen 2 or a Gen 5 2 terabyte. So let's just assume they were all the same capacity. You would also still, in a regular use case, using your computer, playing your games, surfing your internet, going to YouTube, doing whatever you do at night in your own time that I won't judge you for, you will never notice a difference between 3,500 and 12,400. But you certainly will notice a difference in the price. So you got to really ask yourself, if you're not one of those professionals that is like constantly doing major file transfers, and you've got some sort of a NVMe NAS at home that you're constantly moving files around to, you would never notice the speed increase or difference. Even gaming, even games don't take advantage of the load speed that a lot of these NVMEs are capable of doing. In fact, Phil was saying that Ratchet & Clank is the only game that supports direct storage. So everything else, believe it or not, when it comes to seeking a lot of those small files and stuff, from wherever they're stored in the game file system, it's not going to get you anywhere near the advertised speeds. So having the 12,400 versus 3,500 is completely unnecessary. Now, if you're building a super badass system, you probably have all of these things that I've said are above and beyond what you need and a complete waste of money. How my systems are perfect examples of that. Phil's system is an example of that. But the point is, if you're building on any sort of a budget, these are areas that you can easily save money. If you're building yourself an enthusiast PC, you don't care about this sort of stuff anyway. You just want to go with whatever fits, looks good, and you have very little concern on what the cost is because you're just got a big enough budget to where it really doesn't impact it, then none of this is going to matter to you. But with the amount of people that are now starting to build PCs, again, getting into their first PCs or upgrading a 10-year-old PC, this is the kind of stuff that can be overwhelming to them, trying to figure out what is the difference between a Gen 3 and a Gen 5 drive. I've got this whole row of graphics cards and they all look the same. Like for instance, you got a 3060 Ti when it came out, they had a Strix model from Asus that was more expensive than the 3070. And the 3070, even the Founders Edition 3070 would stomp all over a 3060 Ti Strix. But it was more expensive because it said Strix and had a giant cooler on it, which was completely unnecessary because the thing ran like 51 degrees. So you can see how easy it is to waste money. And the brands are banking on the fact that you're not going to know the difference and you're just going to go with the higher priced one because it's going to mean it's better. So anyway, what are your number one, that's a complete waste of money to you? Put it down in the comments. I have a feeling there's going to be an overwhelming repeat of RGB down there. I think we can all agree on that one. But outside of RGB, what is your number one waste of money that you think everyone should just stop doing when it comes to building PC? Sound off down below, guys. And as always, we'll see you in the next one. Oh, it's springtime. The skies are blue. The birds are chirping. We're at Micro Center. It's a great day.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
And the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
Okay, so we're at Micro Center right now. They're sponsoring today's video. I've had an idea of something I've wanted to do for a while that I'm finally gonna get to do. And I brought the truck because I need to make sure I have enough room to bring all of it home. Because what I wanna do is I wanna show, I've talked about ways you can waste money when building a computer. It's easy to waste money, accidentally even. So what we're gonna do is I've picked a tier of parts where they're basically the same. So an i7 14700K, Z790 motherboards, the same 4070 Ti Super tier of graphics card, the same amount of RAM, the same amount of storage, the same size power supply. But what I've done is, with the exception of the case and the CPU, which are identical, we are going to be taking a top tier build where we overspend on a motherboard and we overspend on the graphics card and we overspend on the RAM and we overspend on the storage and we go top of the line on that stuff. And actually not quite as top of the line as we could have with like the motherboard. I think the board I chose was like 600 and something bucks, where I could have gone as high as like $1,200 for the motherboard, which is already stupid, even for an i9 processor. And then we're gonna take the same classification of parts, but at the more entry-level price point. Still sticking with like a Z790 chipset, which, to be honest, we could even go lower than that if we wanted. But then what we're gonna do is we're gonna build the systems and we're gonna show you side by side how much they cost and how much performance you really do, or foreshadowing, don't gain by overspending on your parts. So let's go inside right now. I'm gonna grab the parts, we'll lay them out here on the bed of the truck, and we'll show you, it's kind of eye-opening how different the price points are, because let's just say you could build another mid-tier computer for the savings between one and the other. Okay, so we got both our builds here. We'll kind of go over the expensive build first. Yeah, it may look like it's sponsored by Asus. Remember, this is Micro Center stuff. I just can't help it that they're the most expensive brands, really. We could have gone with like an MSI Godlike, but we didn't on purpose because, like I said, a $1,300 motherboard or $1,200, whatever it is ridiculous. So I went with the Maximus Z790 Dark Hero motherboard. That came in at $579 for a motherboard. Like I said, they're both 14700Ks. The 14700K here was $369 at Micro Center. RAM, I went with, it was 339 bucks. It's 32 gigabytes of 6600 DDR5 from Corsair. It's the Dominator Titaniums. It's beautiful RAM, but you know, it's again very expensive. For storage, we went with 2 terabyte drives for both. This is the T700 from Crucial. It's the T700 Pro, extremely fast drive. Again, kind of expensive though, because it is a top tier product. That came in at $399 for that 2 terabyte drive. Yeah, that's what it came in at. So anyway, for power supply, we went 1000 watt for both of these builds. I wanted to build in some additional headroom for power usage in the future. So 1000 watts I thought was good because we could step up from a 4070 Ti Super to a 4080 Super or 4090 in the future, or maybe whatever next gen gonna melt your connector GPU ends up being. But that's the Thor 1000 watt Platinum, and that costs
Don't make these mistakes when choosing a graphics card in 2024 and 2025. I have compiled the most common mistakes that people make when choosing a graphics card. For those of you who are new to this, then this video should be helpful, and for those of you with experience, you might end up actually agreeing with some of the mentions in the video, so enjoy watching. The first misconception is that Nvidia is better than AMD. This has been one of the most common misconceptions and stereotypes surrounding the choice of either buying from Team Green or Team Red, with most people defaulting to Nvidia as their first option, all because they believe Nvidia is better than AMD. This is partly due to Nvidia being at the forefront of progress, with features like being the first to introduce ray tracing, having better upscaling, first to bring us more features like frame generation, including their massive involvement in AI development and such. This is all great, of course, if not for one thing: price to performance, or FPS per dollar, which is what the competition is all about. The competitors here being AMD and more recently Intel, both of whom have their own slice of the GPU market, with AMD being the leading of the two. AMD up to this point has been able to at least offer somewhat similar features to Nvidia by creating their own upscaling technology like FSR to compete with Nvidia's DLSS, and even introduced. So enjoy watching. The first misconception is that Nvidia is better than AMD. This has been one of the most common misconceptions and stereotypes surrounding the choice of either buying from Team Green or Team Red, with most people defaulting to Nvidia as their first option, all because they believe Nvidia is better than AMD. This is partly due to Nvidia being at the forefront of progress, with features like being the first to introduce ray tracing, having better upscaling, first to bring us more features like frame generation, including their massive involvement in AI development and such. This is all great, of course, if not for one thing: price to performance, or FPS per dollar, which is what the competition is all about. The competitors here being AMD and more recently Intel, both of whom have their own slice of the GPU market, with AMD being the leading of the two. AMD up to this point has been able to at least offer somewhat similar features to Nvidia by creating their own upscaling technology like FSR to compete with Nvidia's DLSS, and even introduced frame generation just like Nvidia, and even some ray tracing is possible on Team Red as well. All this with a lower price tag than Team Green, and with AMD you often get more VRAM, which is always an added bonus since the cards definitely age better than Nvidia's cards, which always have less VRAM, and once you take out the upscaling and decide to opt for raw raster performance without ray tracing enabled, then AMD not only keeps up with Nvidia, but sometimes even outperforms their competitor, while still remaining to be the cheaper option of the two. The conclusion? If you're looking for the best possible option for your budget, don't shy away from looking at the best offers on the market, regardless of them being AMD or Nvidia, since both options trade blows with similar performance across the board, and despite the random differences in some games' performance, it's best to remember that some game engines will favor AMD cards while others favor Nvidia. The only minor disadvantage of Team Red so far has been their ray tracing performance, which leaves Nvidia as the best option for best ray tracing performance. But this is a feature many gamers don't care about or even use, since it is very demanding and butchers the performance regardless of resolution, so most of the time turning on ray tracing is never worth it, so it shouldn't be a deal breaker to get yourself an AMD card, which will without a doubt offer the best price to performance ratio or FPS per dollar compared to Nvidia. Speaking of which, check out the link in the description to get the best offers right now if you're in need of a graphics card. The next point is, should you buy an older flagship or a current gen mid-range? This is a dilemma that has faced some of us in the past. Should I get an older flagship GPU for cheap in the used market, or do you just fork out some more cash and opt for something recent? Take the GTX 1080 Ti for example versus an RTX 4060. The Pascal legend needs no introduction since it's still powerful enough to run most games to date, and it's cheaper on the used market and comes with more VRAM, while the RTX 4060 is stuck on 8GB and is an actual downgrade from its predecessor, the RTX 3060 that has 12GB of VRAM. But the one thing to remember is that it's 2024 and it's been 7 years since the release of the GTX 1080 Ti, so a lot has changed. There are new rendering technologies and anti-aliasing has come a long way since 2017, with some games like Alan Wake 2 requiring mesh shaders to run well, making it an unplayable experience to use anything below an RTX 20 series to run the game. Not to mention, the RTX 4060 is more efficient and runs cooler and better due to the newer architecture and will fare well in modern titles than the older flagship. So the conclusion here is simple. Nostalgia has to remain in the past, so if you're looking to get a GPU, make sure you get something modern that supports the latest technologies, as this will give you better performance and better efficiency than an older card would. The third thing to discuss is how much VRAM will you need. This is where things get tricky. A couple of years ago, 4GB was enough and 8GB was considered overkill, but now 8GB is only suited for lower resolutions like 1080p. This demand in VRAM has caused a shift in the pricing of higher VRAM cards, which have made it impossible to get a good deal on anything above 8GB. However, it's important to pay attention to not ignore the 8GB options if you plan on gaming on 1080p, and it's also good to make sure you don't overpay for the same versions of budget cards with more VRAM like the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB versus 16GB variant. In any case, depending on the resolution you plan to play on, then the VRAM requirements will also be dependent on the same. 6GB GPUs are the bare minimum for 1080p low with an FPS target of 40 to 60 FPS, while 8GB being the most common option that is best for 1080p high. With some help from upscaling, you should get over 60 FPS. However, when choosing cards on the mid-range and over, then the more VRAM you get the better, as this opens up options of gaming on higher resolutions. For 1440p, the VRAM sweet spot is 12GB, as this should give you 2 to 3 more years of gaming before you need to upgrade. For 4K resolutions, then 16GB and above is best, but you will obviously have to pay the VRAM tax since 16GB cards don't come cheap. The conclusion here is get as much VRAM as your budget allows you to, as this is actually a case of more is always best. However, pay attention to the performance of the cards as well, as this could also prove to be an issue if you plan on gaming on higher resolutions. For example, in a choice between an RTX 4060 Ti 16GB and an RX 7700 XT 12GB, then the RX 7700 XT is the better choice as it outperforms the 4060 Ti. Just because the 4060 Ti has 16GB of VRAM doesn't mean it's a 4K gaming GPU, so it might have the VRAM to run higher textures than a 12GB card, but the card itself is still a low-end card that can't take advantage of the larger amount of VRAM, so the clear option here would be the RX 7700 XT with 12GB of VRAM from Team Red. The fourth mistake on our list is don't overpay for the same card. The range of video cards is extensive, with every board partner making their own designs unique to their brand. But sometimes this gets out of hand as the different brands roll out expensive variants of budget cards due to the fancy cooling designs they opt to put on the cards. Some of the cooling solutions end up making the cards too expensive while not adding much functionality for the card for the price. For example, a triple fan cooler on a low-end or mid-range card will cost more than a dual fan cooler version, while the performance will remain the same and the temps will probably be lowered by 2 to 5 degrees, but you will end up paying more for the extra fan, which you can easily do without. Modern card temps range from 65 to 85 degrees or more on the hotspot, so don't obsess over cooling and end up paying an extra 50 or 100 bucks just to get a triple fan version of a card that has dual fan options, or worse, opting for a water-cooled version that could be $300 to $400 more than an air-cooled version of the same card, so be cautious when choosing the different designs available. You could always check the reviews of the card to see if anyone has had overheating issues before you buy. That way you can rest assured you spent the right amount of money on the right cooling. Our fifth issue is some of the specs aren't always as black and white as you would think. So what do I mean by this? When it comes to different architecture, odds are some specs will differ or seem like a step backwards, but that's not always the case. For example, when you compare an RTX 4060 with an RTX 3060, the numbers aren't exactly representative of real-world render performance as you would expect. The RTX 3060 has 28 SMs while the 4060 has 24 SMs. Not only that, but the 3060 has more CUDA cores at 3584 while the 4060 has only 3072. The 3060 has more ray tracing cores and more tensor cores and a wider memory bus of 192 versus the 128 on the 4060. However, all of these specs would have you believe the 3060 will outperform the 4060, but that isn't the case at all. Due to the improvements made in architecture, we get higher clocks on the 4060 and a larger L2 cache of 24 MB that all add up to a 19% performance uplift that gives the 4060 the lead when it comes to in-game performance. So ensure to do your research and watch some benchmarks before assuming the numbers will always add up to performance, since that isn't always the case, since improvements in architecture will always lead to better performance regardless of the specs being somewhat confusing to an inexperienced buyer. Now for the sixth issue, should you always get a higher wattage power supply when upgrading the GPU? Power efficiency has come a long way from what it used to be over a decade ago, which means that technology has evolved as well and PC components are more efficient than they used to be. However, before making a change or upgrading your PSU, or before choosing the highest wattage PSU you can find, then it's best to check the recommended PSU wattage requirement that is just a Google search away. For example, if you want to get an RTX 4070 as an upgrade, then just Google RTX 4070 PSU requirements and you should get a rough estimate of how much wattage your PSU needs to run an entire build with an RTX 4070. In this case, since the GPU needs up to 200 watts, then the recommended PSU capacity ranges from a 550 watt to 650 watt PSU, so if you have a powerful Intel CPU like an i7 or an i9 that can consume up to 200 watts, then a 650 watt PSU would be best. For most lower end cards and mid-range cards, odds are you don't need a new power supply unless you're buying an RTX 4090 level card. That is when you would need an 1000 watt PSU to maximize its potential. So the conclusion here is, before buying your GPU, make sure to check what the recommended PSU wattage is just to make sure you're prepared to run the new GPU. There are sites that can help you calculate how much wattage your system is expected to use and what PSU wattage range is best for your build, so it's best to use such sites to ensure you don't end up below the recommended wattage. Now moving on to our seventh and final issue. Is it a must to upgrade the processor when upgrading your GPU? I won't argue with the fact that more recent the processor, the faster it is, but is it a must to upgrade the CPU every time you upgrade your GPU? Most games today require a minimum of 4 cores and 8 threads, with the optimal choice being to opt for a CPU with 6 cores and 12 threads or more for a better all-rounded gaming experience. The current CPUs on the market are the Ryzen 7000 and 9000 series, and Intel's 14th gen and the new 200 series, and they both come with a ton of options when it comes to the number of cores you're looking for. However, if you feel the need to get a CPU that can remain relevant for a couple of years, then I recommend to always check what the consoles are using. And this generation of consoles is using 8-core CPUs with 16 threads, so if you have the budget for it, that would be a good baseline to help you get a CPU that holds its own for another 2 generations or more, as most games are often going to be optimized to run on similar hardware as the current generation of consoles, so you can always count on getting a decent build if you use that method when buying your components. But is it a must to upgrade the CPU when you swap a new GPU into your build? If you're using a CPU that is at least an Intel 10th gen or a Ryzen 3rd gen, then it's not as urgent to do so. It's always best to look for some benchmarks showing how your CPU performs with the GPU you choose to buy when compared to other current CPUs to see whether there is a need to upgrade. It's also best to consider the resolution you plan on playing on, as lower resolutions will be dependent on the CPU more than higher resolutions. 1080p is the most CPU dependent, while 1440p is a middle ground, and 4K is basically GPU dependent, which means a faster CPU is best for 1080p, but a faster GPU is best for 4K. I have left links in the description and the pinned comment with the best CPUs and the best video card combos for 2024, so check them out and get yourself some upgrades.
You want to build a sick gaming PC on a reasonable budget. But the thing is, $1,000 doesn't stretch as far as it used to. Even a console can cost that much these days. Maybe the solution is time travel. No, not literally. I mean taking your parts selection back a few generations. But how much performance are you leaving on the table? I mean, 9600 is a much higher number than 5700, so it must be a much better choice, right? Right? No. And in fact, these two CPUs are kind of the perfect springboard for our little investigation/experiment here. Should we just stop buying the latest hardware? To find out, we built 2 entire systems using 2 wildly different philosophies. This one can only use current generation parts, while this one can reach as far back into the past as it wants in search of the best bang for the buck. Now, as you would expect, pricing's always changing. So if we built these systems a week ago or a week from now, we might get very different computers. But we're still interested in identifying any trends, tips, and tricks that we can see that might help you get the most out of your next build, or even your current one. We're also interested in identifying our sponsor, MSI. Power up your rig with the MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi motherboard. It supports AMD Ryzen 9000 CPUs and ultra-fast Wi-Fi 7, plus it's got RGB. Check it out at the link in the video description. AMD doesn't really do new Ryzen 3 CPUs anymore, so our brand new PC was kind of stuck with the Ryzen 7 9600X. Not that that's a terrible thing. I mean, when you consider that it uses Zen 5 versus the Zen 3 we're going to be using in this system, you'd think the answer would be obvious. But our older 5700X 3D has 2 extra cores and is packed to the gills with 3D V-Cache. Now, this chip hasn't quite achieved 1080 Ti levels of legendary, but the more than $150 savings versus its bigger brother frees up some very interesting budget for some big upgrades later on. That's benefit numero uno of the old is gold philosophy: choice. Not only is there generally more selection, but you can get substantial discounts on new in-box hardware that retailers are hoping to clear from their shelves. That is, as long as you're ready to strike. There can be trade-offs though. For example, our 5700X 3D here uses socket AM4, which is a dead end for future upgrades and even for some current ones. Even if you paired this chip with the best compatible motherboard on the market, you'd still be stuck with PCIe Gen 4 and DDR4 memory. Although, it's worth noting those probably aren't major considerations at a $1,000 budget. Even our SSD, we'd have probably stuck with a Gen 4 boot drive even if we had extra money to spend. Gen 5 drives cost more, don't really benefit gaming, and they run hotter. At least they do today. But who knows what the future holds for devices that'll fit in these slots. And being compatible with future hardware is a tangible advantage for Team Shiny here. It can also be an advantage today. DDR5, all other things being equal, offers a small but measurable benefit over DDR4, and our 16 gigs of T-Force Delta RGB fit perfectly in our budget. We would have rather gone with something a little bit faster, but that kind of trade-off is kind of our point. If we want something new, we don't always get a best-in-class part. It has gotten really hard to spec a well-rounded $1,000 machine with all new-gen parts. Meanwhile, in TARDIS land, though, we got that same 16 gig capacity, but this time right in the price-performance sweet spot, with the only downside being that when we want to upgrade a few years down the road, we're going to need to replace our CPU, RAM, and motherboard all in one fell swoop. Speaking of motherboard, this ASUS Prime B550MA is a pretty good value when it's on sale for around $100. Meanwhile, this Gigabyte X870 Gaming Plus Wi-Fi 6 ran us $220. That is a huge difference. But then again, so is Wi-Fi 6, PCIe Gen 5 for both the GPU and SSD, not to mention an AM5 socket, which AMD has committed to support until at least 2027. That means new chips, new drivers, and, maybe most importantly, new security updates. AMD has recently said that they will not be patching Ryzen 1000, 2000, or 3000 series chips for the sync close vulnerability, although they backtracked on the 3000 series after some community outrage, and seeing as the latest 3000 series came out in 2020, the same year that we started getting 5000 series processors, the end of support for our older platform, oh, not that one, this one, is probably coming soon. Clearly that won't matter when it comes to our next part though, the case. On this side, we've got our random old case that was cheap. And over here, we've got the Phanteks Eclipse G360A. Now in terms of size and features, they're both fairly similar, but with cases, the devil's in the details. Good ventilation, cable management that's not gonna cut your fingers, and some high quality included fans. Very nice, Phanteks. Meanwhile over here, this is what fit in our budget?
Heck yeah.
Cool, well, thankfully we probably won't need as much cooling for these components because we're not gonna have it. There is cable management though, and it's got one fan included. I expect our Corsair CX 650 watt to give us a better long-term experience than our $41 Thermaltake Smart 600 watt. But it was the only thing that fit in this budget. And honestly speaking, even our better Corsair could end up near its limit. If you were to replicate these builds, we would strongly recommend a juicier power supply for both of these systems. And if you are, by the way, we're going to have all the parts linked down below.
You'll notice that what's in this system is not actually the 600 watt one. This is such a crappy power supply, it wouldn't even boot the system.
Is this over budget now?
It's a $20 more for 60 more watts. Seems to be doing the trick, but yeah.
For our cooler, we settled on the Thermalright Phantom Spirit. It's so nice,